Hello and welcome to this video about the Ukrainian War. Over the years, this conflict has become increasingly complex and has drawn in a number of international players, including Russia, Ukraine, the United States, and the European Union. In this video, we'll be taking a deep dive into the key events and factors that have shaped the Ukrainian War. To give you an idea of what we'll be covering, we'll start by looking at the historical and cultural context of the conflict, including Ukraine's complex relationship with Russia. From there, we'll move into the timeline of the conflict, which can be roughly divided into two phases: the initial unrest and protests in Ukraine in late 2013 and early 2014, and the ongoing military conflict that began later that year and continues to this day. November 2013, protests begin in Ukraine after the government announces it will suspend plans to sign a trade agreement with the European Union. Many Ukrainians view this move as an attempt to cozy up to Russia. The association agreement with the EU would have strengthened Ukraine's political and economic ties with Europe, but Yanukovych's decision to reject it was widely seen as a concession to Russia, which had opposed the deal. The protests in Maidan Nezalezhnosti, which began in late November 2013, were largely peaceful at first, but turned violent in late January 2014 as clashes between protesters and police left several people dead. Yanukovych fled Ukraine in February 2014 after months of protests and a vote by the Ukrainian parliament to remove him from office. He later resurfaced in Russia, where he has been granted asylum. The overthrow of Yanukovych and the installation of a pro-Western government in Ukraine triggered Russia's annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of fighting in eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian separatists seized control of several cities and declared independent republics. The Maidan protests, also known as the Euromaidan, are often seen as a turning point in Ukrainian history, marking a decisive break with the country's Soviet past and a new orientation toward the West. However, they also set in motion a chain of events that have had far-reaching consequences for Ukraine, Russia, and the wider world. February 2014, violence erupts in Ukraine, with police clashing with protesters in Kiev's Independence Square. The situation quickly escalates, with more than 100 people killed in just a few days. February 2014 was a critical month in the conflict in Ukraine, as it marked the escalation of violence between anti-government protesters and the government of then-President Viktor Yanukovych. The protests had been ongoing since November 2013, when Yanukovych announced he would not sign an association agreement with the European Union. As the protests continued, tensions rose between the government and the opposition. On February 18th, clashes broke out between protesters and riot police in Kiev's Independence Square, known as Maidan Nezalezhnosti. The situation quickly escalated, with more than 100 people killed in just a few days. The violence led to the signing of a truce agreement on February 21st, which called for the withdrawal of police from Kiev's Independence Square and the release of detained protesters. However, the truce quickly broke down, and Yanukovych fled the country on February 22, 2014. The following day, Ukraine's parliament voted to remove Yanukovych from office and set a date for new presidential elections. The events of February 2014 marked a turning point in the conflict in Ukraine, as the country was plunged into political turmoil and uncertainty. The ousting of Yanukovych was seen as a victory for the opposition and pro-European demonstrators, but it also sparked anger and unrest among Yanukovych's supporters in eastern and southern Ukraine, who felt their political and economic interests were being threatened by the new government. February 22, 2014, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych is ousted from power and flees the country. February 22, 2014 marked a turning point in Ukraine's political crisis. After months of protests, President Yanukovych was ousted from power and forced to flee the country. The Ukrainian parliament voted to remove him from office and appointed an interim president, Oleksandr Turchinov, to serve until new elections could be held. Yanukovych's ouster was celebrated by many Ukrainians who saw him as corrupt and beholden to Russia. However, it was also a major blow to Russian interests in the region. Russia saw Yanukovych as an ally and had invested heavily in propping up his government. His ouster was seen as a direct challenge to Russia's influence in Ukraine and the wider region. The events of February 22 would set the stage for a much larger conflict between Ukraine and Russia. March 2014, Russia annexes Crimea, a peninsula in Ukraine with a significant Russian-speaking population. The move is widely condemned by the international community. March 2014, following the ousting of President Yanukovych, Russian forces take control of Crimea, a Ukrainian peninsula with a predominantly ethnic Russian population. Russian President Vladimir Putin claims that Russia is protecting its ethnic and linguistic minorities from persecution, and the annexation is widely condemned by the international community. The United Nations General Assembly passes a resolution declaring the annexation invalid, and many countries impose economic sanctions on Russia in response. Despite this, Russia continues to hold on to Crimea, which remains a major point of contention between Ukraine and Russia. April 2014, pro-Russian separatists seize control of several cities in eastern Ukraine. Fighting between Ukrainian government forces and separatists intensifies. April 2014 marks a turning point in the Ukrainian conflict, as pro-Russian separatists seized control of several cities in eastern Ukraine, including Donetsk and Luhansk. The separatists, who were armed and supported by Russia, declared independent people's republics in these areas and began to take control of local government buildings and infrastructure. Ukrainian government forces responded by launching a military operation to regain control of these areas, sparking a violent and protracted conflict. The conflict in eastern Ukraine escalated quickly, with both sides exchanging fire and casualties mounting. The separatists received support from Russian military advisors and soldiers, as well as weapons and other supplies. The conflict soon became a proxy war between Russia and Ukraine, with Ukraine accusing Russia of direct involvement in the conflict, which Russia denied. The fighting in eastern Ukraine resulted in the displacement of thousands of people and widespread destruction of homes, businesses, and infrastructure. The Ukrainian government imposed martial law in the affected regions and launched a military operation to push back against the separatists. The conflict also had geopolitical consequences, with the United States and European Union imposing economic sanctions on Russia in response to its involvement in the conflict. Russia responded with counter-sanctions, and relations between Russia and the West deteriorated further. Despite numerous ceasefire agreements and diplomatic efforts to end the conflict, fighting continues in eastern Ukraine to this day, with occasional spikes in violence causing further casualties and displacement. July 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 is shot down over eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. Western governments blame pro-Russian separatists for the attack. July 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, is shot down over eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 passengers and crew members on board. The aircraft crashed near the village of Rybov, in the Donetsk Oblast region, where fighting between Ukrainian government forces and Russian-backed separatists was ongoing. The incident prompted an immediate international outcry, with Western governments blaming the pro-Russian separatists for the attack. In the aftermath, both sides of the conflict engaged in a blame game, with the separatists denying any involvement and accusing Ukrainian government forces of shooting down the plane. However, a Dutch-led investigation later concluded that a Buk missile system brought from Russia was responsible for the downing of the aircraft. The tragedy of Flight MH17 further escalated tensions between Ukraine and Russia, with Western countries imposing sanctions on Russia and increasing support for Ukraine. The incident also raised questions about the level of military support that Russia was providing to the separatists in eastern Ukraine, which Russia denied. The investigation into the downing of MH17 is ongoing, with 4 suspects, 3 Russians and 1 Ukrainian, facing charges of murder in the Netherlands. However, Russia has refused to cooperate with the investigation and denies any involvement in the attack. September 2014, a ceasefire agreement is reached between Ukrainian government forces and separatists. However, fighting continues in many parts of eastern Ukraine. September 2014 marked the signing of a ceasefire agreement between the Ukrainian government and pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. The agreement was brokered in Minsk, Belarus, and was seen as a step towards ending the conflict that had been raging for several months. The ceasefire called for a halt to all hostilities and the withdrawal of heavy weapons from the front lines. However, the ceasefire was repeatedly violated, with both sides accusing each other of continuing to launch attacks. Fighting continued in several hotspots, including the Donetsk airport and the town of Debaltseve, where Ukrainian forces were surrounded and eventually forced to retreat. Despite the ceasefire, tensions between Ukraine and Russia remained high. The annexation of Crimea by Russia in March 2014 had already led to Western sanctions against Russia, and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine further strained relations between Russia and the West. The conflict also took a heavy toll on the civilian population in eastern Ukraine. Thousands were killed, and many more were displaced from their homes. Humanitarian organizations struggled to provide aid to those affected by the fighting, with access to some areas limited due to the ongoing violence. February 2015, a new ceasefire agreement is signed, but fighting continues in spite of the agreement. February 2015, a new ceasefire agreement is signed in Minsk, Belarus, following months of negotiations. The agreement calls for a ceasefire in eastern Ukraine, the withdrawal of heavy weapons, and the exchange of prisoners. However, despite the agreement, fighting continues in many parts of eastern Ukraine. Both sides accuse each other of violating the ceasefire. In the following months, there are sporadic outbreaks of violence and ceasefire violations. In September 2015, the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany meet in Minsk for a summit aimed at resolving the conflict. The summit produces a roadmap for ending the fighting, which includes the withdrawal of heavy weapons and the establishment of a demilitarized zone. December 2015, the European Union extends economic sanctions against Russia over its role in the conflict. December 2015, the European Union extends economic sanctions against Russia over its role in the conflict. The sanctions were first imposed in March 2014 after Russia annexed Crimea and were subsequently extended due to continued fighting in eastern Ukraine. The measures include restrictions on financial transactions, a ban on certain exports to Russia, and a travel ban and asset freeze on individuals and entities deemed responsible for the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of eastern Ukraine. The sanctions have had a significant impact on the Russian economy, but have also had consequences for some European businesses with trade ties to Russia. Despite the sanctions, fighting in eastern Ukraine continued, with both sides accusing the other of violating the ceasefire agreements. January 2017, the new U.S. President, Donald Trump, says he wants to improve relations with Russia, leading to speculation about what his administration's policy towards Ukraine will be. January 2017, the inauguration of Donald Trump as the new U.S. President raises questions about the future of U.S. policy towards Ukraine. Trump had expressed a desire to improve relations with Russia during his campaign, and this leads to speculation about whether he will take a softer stance towards Russia's actions in Ukraine. Trump's national security advisor at the time, Michael Flynn, reportedly discussed lifting sanctions against Russia with the Russian ambassador to the United States, which further fuels concerns about the Trump administration's stance on the conflict. In response to Russia's continued involvement in the conflict, the United States provides military aid to Ukraine, including anti-tank missiles and other weapons. However, there are concerns about the Trump administration's commitment to providing this aid, particularly as Trump publicly questions the value of the aid and the U.S.'s role in the conflict. The situation in eastern Ukraine remains tense, with fighting continuing and occasional flare-ups of violence, particularly around the city of Donetsk. The Minsk II ceasefire agreement is still in effect, but it has not brought an end to the conflict, and both sides accuse the other of violations. November 2018, Russia seizes 3 Ukrainian naval vessels in the Kerch Strait, a narrow channel between Crimea and mainland Russia. On November 25, 2018, Russian border guards opened fire on and seized 3 Ukrainian naval vessels attempting to pass through the Kerch Strait, a narrow channel between Crimea and mainland Russia. The incident resulted in the injury of several Ukrainian sailors and the seizure of the ships. Russia claimed that the Ukrainian vessels had illegally entered its territorial waters, while Ukraine maintained that the ships were in international waters and accused Russia of an act of aggression. The incident marked a significant escalation in tensions between the two countries and led to international condemnation of Russia's actions. Several countries, including the United States and European Union, imposed additional sanctions on Russia in response to the incident. The seized Ukrainian sailors were later released in a prisoner exchange in September 2019 as part of efforts to de-escalate the conflict. April 2019, comedian Volodymyr Zelensky is elected president of Ukraine. He runs on a platform of ending the conflict and improving relations with Russia. April 2019, comedian Volodymyr Zelensky is elected president of Ukraine, defeating the incumbent president Petro Poroshenko. Zelensky, who had no prior political experience, ran on a platform of anti-corruption, economic reform, and a resolution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. He also expressed a desire to improve relations with Russia, a position that was controversial in Ukraine, given Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for separatists in the east. Zelensky's victory was seen as a rejection of the political establishment in Ukraine and a desire for change. He had gained popularity through his role in a television series where he played a high school teacher who becomes president of Ukraine after a video of him giving a passionate speech goes viral. Zelensky's election was closely watched by the international community, especially given the ongoing conflict with Russia. Many hoped that his lack of political baggage and fresh perspective would bring new momentum to the peace talks. However, others were skeptical, given his lack of experience and the challenges of dealing with Russia's aggressive stance towards Ukraine. Zelensky has taken several steps to try and resolve the conflict, including implementing a new ceasefire agreement and establishing a direct dialogue with the separatists. He has also pursued economic reforms and sought to reduce corruption in Ukraine. However, progress towards peace has been slow, with fighting still occurring in many parts of the Donbass region. Despite the challenges, Zelensky's presidency has brought a renewed sense of hope to Ukraine and the international community. Many believe that his commitment to reform and willingness to engage in dialogue with all sides will eventually lead to a peaceful resolution of the conflict. As of September 2021, the conflict in Ukraine remains ongoing, with occasional flare-ups of violence. The ceasefire agreement reached in July 2019 is still in place, but it is fragile and frequently violated. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, continues to monitor the ceasefire and reports on any violations. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the conflict have been ongoing since it began in 2014. The Normandy format, which includes the leaders of Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France, has been instrumental in diplomatic talks. The group has met several times to discuss the conflict, with the most recent meeting taking place in December 2019. Additionally, the Trilateral Contact Group, which includes representatives from Ukraine, Russia, and the OSCE, meets regularly to discuss the implementation of the Minsk Agreements, a set of ceasefire agreements signed in 2015. The Minsk agreements aim to resolve the conflict in eastern Ukraine through a series of political and economic measures. However, progress on diplomatic efforts has been slow and sporadic. The COVID-19 pandemic has also complicated efforts, as face-to-face meetings have been difficult to arrange. Despite diplomatic efforts, the conflict remains unresolved, and tensions between Ukraine and Russia continue. In recent months, there have been some positive developments. In April 2021, Russia announced it was withdrawing its troops from the border with Ukraine, a move that was welcomed by Ukrainian officials. Additionally, in July 2021, Ukraine and the European Union signed an agreement to deepen their political and economic ties, which could provide some economic relief to Ukraine. Overall, while diplomatic efforts continue, the conflict in Ukraine remains a complex and difficult issue to resolve. As the international community continues to monitor the situation and explore diplomatic solutions, it is important to remember the human toll of the conflict and to work towards a lasting peace that benefits all parties involved. We hope that this video has provided you with a better understanding of the history and current state of the Ukrainian conflict. Thank you for watching.